My name is Evelyn Sanders. And today I turned 30. That evening, my mother, Dorothy Sanders, raised a glass of champagne and said a sentence that made the room fall so silent that I could hear someone slowly set a fork down on a plate. Today we are gathered here to celebrate the birthday of my daughter, Evelyn Sanders, she said. Although, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what there is to be proud of. She paused for a moment, looked around at the people sitting at the table, and added with a slight smile. But whatever she may be like, she is still my daughter. A few people laughed awkwardly. Someone looked away. Someone pretended to be very focused on their glass. And I stood there, looking at her. At Dorothy Sanders. My mother. The woman half this city called a business shark. The woman who had built her company almost from scratch. The woman people respected, and at the same time feared. And it was this very woman who was now standing in the middle of my apartment, explaining to the guests at my birthday party that she had nothing to be proud of in her own daughter. At that moment, I understood one simple thing. This was not a toast. It was a public humiliation. Evelyn turned 30 today, my mother, Dorothy Sanders, continued. An age when a person should already understand what they are worth. She took a sip of champagne. And what they are capable of achieving in life. Her eyes stopped on me. Unfortunately, my daughter has always been too soft. Someone coughed quietly. Someone lowered their eyes. But my mother kept speaking calmly, as if she were discussing the weather. And as you all know, the world does not like soft people. I stood beside the table and felt my fingers slowly tighten around my glass. Because I already knew where this conversation was going. I had heard it many times before. But usually, behind closed doors. Not in front of people. Not in front of my guests. And certainly not at my own birthday. But my mother had always believed that softness was weakness. And that weak people had to be taught how life worked. Even if that meant doing it in front of everyone. After my mother's words, Dorothy Sanders, a heavy silence hung over the room. No one raised a glass. No one said, "To your health." People just stood there, trying to pretend that everything happening was normal. Someone lowered their eyes to their plate. Someone suddenly became very interested in examining the tablecloth. One man by the window took a long sip of wine, as if hoping that if he looked busy enough, the moment would end faster. But it didn't end. My mother continued standing in the middle of the room as calmly as if she had just given the most ordinary toast. And in a way, for her, it really was ordinary. She always said exactly what she thought. Especially when it came to me. 30 is a serious age, she continued. Her voice was even. Calm. As if she were reading a business report. At this age, a person should already understand what they are worth. She slowly let her gaze travel around the room. And then looked at me again. And what they are capable of achieving in life. I felt my shoulders tense slightly. I knew that tone. I had heard it all my life. Sometimes at dinner. Sometimes in the car. Sometimes on the phone. But almost always in private. Not in front of people. Not in front of my friends. Not in front of her business partners. But today she had decided to make an exception. When I was 30, my mother, Dorothy Sanders, said, I was already running a company. Several of her business partners nodded approvingly. They knew that story. My mother really had built her business almost from nothing. In this city, people respected her. Sometimes they even admired her. She knew how to make decisions quickly. Harshly. Without unnecessary emotion. And in her opinion, that was exactly how every person should live. I already knew what I wanted from life, she continued. She looked at me again. And gave a slight shrug. But Evelyn has always been a little different. It almost sounded gentle. But I knew that those words were always followed by something else. I noticed how one woman standing near the sofa carefully shifted her gaze from my mother to me. Her face showed obvious discomfort. But still, no one stepped in. Because arguing with Dorothy Sanders was not the best idea. Evelyn has always been too calm, my mother said. She took another sip of champagne. Too soft. She tilted her head slightly. And as you understand, the world does not like soft people. For a few seconds, no one said anything. And then one of the guests cautiously said, "But Evelyn does have a home." He said it as if he wanted to soften the conversation at least a little. I turned my head toward him. For a second, I even thought it might end there. That my mother would just nod and change the subject. But my mother never missed an opportunity to finish what she had started. She slowly turned her head toward the man who had spoken. And raised an eyebrow. "A home?" she repeated calmly. She paused. And looked at me. As if this were exactly the moment she had been waiting for. "A home?" my mother, Dorothy Sanders, repeated, lifting her eyebrows slightly. She slowly turned the glass in her hand, as if considering the question. "Yes. Evelyn does indeed have a home." For a second, I actually thought the conversation would end now. That she would simply nod. And we would finally move on to dinner. But my mother never missed the chance to say the rest. She took a small sip of champagne. And calmly said, "Because I helped her buy it." Several people exchanged glances. I felt something inside me slowly tighten. But my mother continued. She never would have earned it on her own. The words were spoken quietly. Without anger. Without shouting. As if it were just a dry fact. But that was exactly what made them sound even heavier. I looked at her and tried to understand why she was doing this. Why she needed to say all of this now. In front of everyone. At my own birthday party. I set my glass down on the table. Very carefully. Because if I had held it for even one more second, it probably would have shattered in my hand. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their places. Someone quietly said, "Dorothy." But my mother did not even look in that person's direction. She kept looking at me. Her gaze was calm. Cold. The same gaze I remembered from childhood. "I'm just telling the truth," she said. "Evelyn has always lived a little, in her own world." She gave a slight shrug. "A world where it is enough just to have an ordinary job and think that is enough." She gestured lightly around the room. But real life works differently. I felt that familiar sensation begin rising in my chest. A mixture of anger, pain, and something else I could not immediately name. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped from my lips on their own. "Why are you always like this with me?" The room fell silent again. My mother slowly turned toward me. And an almost surprised smile appeared on her face. As if she genuinely did not understand why I was asking that question. "Because if I didn't tell you the truth," she said calmly, "you would live in illusions." She took another sip of champagne. And added, "You would think that everything you have, you achieved on your own." She looked directly into my eyes. "But without me, Evelyn, you are nobody." After her words, the room became so quiet that I heard someone slowly inhale. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone simply looked back and forth between me and my mother, Dorothy Sanders. She stood there calmly. As if she had just said something completely obvious. As if this were an ordinary conversation. I felt a strange sensation rising inside me. Not a scream. Not a breakdown. But something colder. I looked at her. "So I'm nobody?" I asked quietly. She tilted her head slightly. "Evelyn, don't be dramatic," she answered calmly. She set her glass down on the table. "I'm just telling the truth." She looked at the guests. Then back at me. "At your age, I was already building a business." Several people standing near her exchanged awkward looks. But my mother kept speaking. "I knew what I wanted from life." She spread her hands slightly. "But you." She went silent for a second. As if choosing the right word. "You're too soft." She said it calmly. Almost gently. But it sounded like a sentence. "People will use you," she added. "Because the world does not respect people like that." She looked directly at me. "I'm just trying to teach you about life." For a few seconds, I said nothing. I could feel people in the room begin to shift. Someone awkwardly moved from one foot to the other. Someone whispered something quietly to the person beside them. But in that moment, a strange thought suddenly struck me. This was not the first time I had heard all of this. All those words. About softness. About weakness. About how I understood nothing about life. She had been saying those things to me for years. But only now, standing in the center of the room and listening to her say it all in front of everyone, did I suddenly begin to understand one thing. It was not only about me. I slowly looked at her. And unexpectedly, the name of someone we almost never spoke about rose in my mind. Roy. My father. The man who had left our family when I was still a teenager. At the time, I had been told one simple sentence. He just couldn't handle it. For a long time, I wondered what that meant. Couldn't handle what? Work. Life. Responsibility. But the older I got, the more often I began to notice one strange detail. After he left, my mother became even harsher. Even colder. Even more demanding. Especially with me. And suddenly, standing in that room, I asked myself a question I had spent years trying not to ask. What if my father, Roy, hadn't left for no reason? What if he too had once stood in front of her and heard the very same words? We almost never spoke about my father. His name seemed to exist somewhere at the edge of our lives. Sometimes I heard it by accident. In relatives' conversations. In fragments of old stories. But in our house, his name was rarely spoken. Roy. When I was little, I was told only one thing. He just couldn't handle it. Back then, I did not ask extra questions. I was a child. It seemed to me that adults always knew what was right. But over time, I began noticing things I had not understood before. For example, how sharply my mother changed when someone mentioned him. How her face turned cold. How quickly she changed the subject. And how one day she said something to me that I did not fully understand at the time. Weak people always leave. For a long time, I thought I understood what she meant. That my father simply had not been strong enough for our family. But now, standing in front of her, in front of all these people, I suddenly saw everything a little differently. I looked at Dorothy Sanders. At the woman the whole city considered a symbol of strength. And suddenly a simple thought appeared in my mind. Maybe it wasn't that Roy was weak. Maybe he simply could not keep living next to someone who turned every word into a weapon. I took a slow breath. And looked at her. At the woman who was now standing in front of me, explaining to everyone that her daughter was nobody. And in that moment, I suddenly understood something else. She had never tried to make me stronger. Never. She had only tried to make me like her. Hard. Cold. Ready to fight for money, for power, for status. But I had never wanted that kind of life. I did not need to conquer the whole world. It was enough for me simply to live. And perhaps that was exactly what she could never forgive me for. I looked at her. And for the first time all evening, I felt not anger. But a strange calm. Because in that moment, I suddenly understood one thing. My mother was not trying to humiliate me. She was trying to convince herself that her path was the only right one. Because if she admitted that it was possible to live differently, then she would have to admit that all these years, she might have been wrong. I slowly picked up my bag from the chair. And all the eyes in the room turned to me again. When I picked up my bag from the chair, the room fell silent again. That special kind of silence when people understand that something important is about to happen. I felt dozens of eyes on me. Some looked with curiosity. Some with obvious sympathy. And some simply because they did not know where else to look. I slowly turned to my mother. To Dorothy Sanders. She stood in the same place. Calm. Confident. As if everything happening was just another scene she completely controlled. She did not even look surprised. More like, slightly annoyed. Evelyn, she said. Don't make a scene. Her voice was even. The way she would speak to one of her employees. We're just talking. I looked at her. And for the first time that evening, I felt that there was neither fear nor anger inside me. Only clarity. No, I said quietly. I took a step toward the door. You are talking. She frowned slightly. I'm just telling the truth, she answered. Sometimes people need to hear it. I nodded. Maybe. I looked at her one more time. At the woman who had spent her entire life believing that strength was measured by money, control, victories. But you know, I said calmly. She lifted her chin slightly. What? I held her gaze. And suddenly realized that for the first time in my life, I was not going to prove anything to her. I was not going to justify myself. I was not going to explain my life. I simply said, then live now with your money and your success. Several people near the table turned their heads sharply. I continued calmly. Because you no longer have a daughter. The room became completely silent. Someone quietly exhaled. Someone slowly lowered their eyes. And I saw an expression flash across my mother's face for a second, one I had never seen before. Not anger. Not irritation. But something very close to confusion. But it lasted only for a moment. I turned around, opened the door, and walked out of the apartment. Out of my own birthday party. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. As if the air had become lighter. As if, at last, it had finally become quiet inside me.